Hello, my name is Matt Dawkins, and I'm a software engineer from Kitware, and I'm here today to talk about the FishTrack dataset that we've been putting together with some collaborators from NOAA Fisheries, FMR, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and some other sources. It contains a number of annotated sequences of fish and underwater data specifically. And first, I'll start with a quick overview of the dataset, why we made it, followed by briefly covering our annotation interface, and then lastly, some baseline algorithms trained on the dataset. One of the main goals of the FishTrack dataset is to help develop non-invasive methods for estimating fish species populations in an assortment of different regions. Data might come from drop cameras, automated underwater vehicles, trawled sensors, and be useful for applications such as fisheries regulation. Marine biologists typically perform this in a manual process right now, where they use metrics such as max-n and scroll through videos identifying frames with the maximum number of a particular target species of interest, and then extrapolate these over multiple collects and sensor placements to larger population counts. Our goal is to help automate this process and use this dataset to facilitate this. To that end, we've generated a dataset with roughly 800,000 individual annotations broken up amongst 26,000 tracks in this particular release. Not every frame of the dataset contains a fish, and some contain many, especially when schools are present. The dataset's freely available online via FTP download at the given website and is also available via torrent download. Outside of tracks, even though it's not the primary focus of this dataset, there's roughly 200 species labels. That said, about 10% of the tracks in this dataset have an unknown fish label when it was unknown what the fish was. It's currently generated amongst 5 different camera systems, and all of these systems were deployed in natural environments. As you'll see in the videos in this and the next few slides, each sub-dataset contains both some unique and shared properties. Some are grayscale, some color. All are high definition at either 720p or 1080p resolutions. All were annotated at least 5 Hz, typically 10 Hz to serve as a balance between annotation time and track fidelity. Each dataset has different types of obstructions, either natural or man-made, within the video. The first dataset shown here, the NOAA Southeast Fisheries CMAP dataset collected in the Gulf of Mexico, has multiple cameras within a cage, so the bars of the cage are visible. This creates extra occlusion difficulties in processing the dataset. The second, data from the NOAA Pacific Islands mouse camera system, contains a bait within many of its videos, which disperses food at a fixed interval. The 3 other sub-datasets all contain color imagery. Similar to the mouse system, the FMR dropcam has a bait apparatus shown in most of its sequences. The FMR Game of Trawl dataset is unique in that it has a non-natural background, particularly a net in the back of a trawl system. While the background is not purely natural, the movement of fish and scaling issues in the collection isn't too different from the others, hence why it was included. The CDFW dataset is unique in that it's one of the only freshwater collects here, containing a slightly higher amount of natural debris and particles in the water. Many lake videos were not used due to very high water turbidity. From the computer vision perspective, there's a number of challenges in these datasets. On the left, you can see a number of particulates in the water, such as debris, sediments, and marine snow. On the right, you can see a school of fish coming across the camera, creating a very, very high number of occlusions, overlapping targets, fish at multiple scales, and other issues. When fish are moving over open ocean, they're much easier to see than when they're across a dynamic natural substrate. Sometimes the only thing you can make out is a very slight motion signature, as the fish can be camouflaged against the background. As lighting conditions and water turbidity changes, fish may be observed disappearing to the background and either reappearing in a nearby position after a short amount of time or not returning into the view at all. In more extreme cases, the fish might be very, very small and a species not directly identifiable. In these cases, the only way a human annotator is able to observe these fish is by moving the frame indicator in the annotation software back and forth in order to see a slight motion signature over time. While not all of the annotations in this dataset were generating using this toolkit, a majority was using the VIAME, or Video and Image Analytics for Multiple Environments, annotation and model development software in order to generate these annotations. It is not, however, a requirement for inclusion in future releases of this ensemble to use this annotation software. VIAME itself is a do-it-yourself AI toolkit that can be applied to multiple types of imagery and video, not necessarily just maritime video. It contains a number of workflows for generating different types of object detectors or classifiers and allows end users to annotate their data sets of interest and then train different types of assorted models on them. Outside of detection problems, it supports other things that are sometimes specific to maritime imagery, but sometimes not, such as image enhancement, image registration and mosaicing, some initial 3D and altitude estimation processes, stereo measurement, and lastly, video search and rapid model generation, which is an atypical process for generating models, not deep learning where you necessarily annotate a ton of video and then compare and contrast different types of models. It contains a number of different annotation interfaces, although the two primary ones for this dataset was the dive interface shown on the bottom right and the view interface, which is a desktop interface. We have begun comparing different approaches on this dataset, though this is an ongoing process as we integrate additional methods and learn a little bit more about it. Traditionally, we've just focused on 3 or 4 different detection, tracking, and classification methods. For detection, the same architecture, just cascade RCNN applied in different fashions. One, taking the image, the input image, and then just resizing it to a 800 by 600 individual chip, and then just using the network as is. A second, performing a gridding approach in addition to that, where we don't do any native resizing of the image. We just grid it up into the fixed tiles and then process that alongside the downsampled image. And then lastly, a third approach that includes some basic motion information into the base layers by computing 2 different motion masks and feeding that in. The multi-scale approach tended to outperform the motion improvements slightly, but ideally we want to combine the two in the next step. On the tracking end, we compared 3 completely different approaches: the tracking untrackable approach, a multi-target version of SciMRPN, and the byte track. Additional notes about how we developed those approaches can be found in the paper for those who want to check it out. Lastly, for final classification and evaluation, which can help reduce false alarm in the data set, we looked at ResNet, a couple variants of that, EfficientNet v2, particularly combining track averaging alongside tracks and comparing that to just the classifiers trained individually. And then also adding a separate large and small classifier, when the input chip around each fish detection is relatively big or small, which had some minor improvements on top of that. Our scores are currently slightly lower than those on the MOT 17 and MOT 20 person tracking challenges, most likely due to the difficulties of this data set. There are a number of avenues for future work on this data set. Near term, we aim to use semi-automated techniques to turn our boxes into polygons and then vet the polygons with human annotation. Secondly, we plan on adding head-tail locations onto these annotations, again using partial automation, in order to assist with measurement. There are a number of different algorithms we wish to compare on the data set, particularly different ways to fuse motion into our detectors and trackers. Lastly, we might make other additional ensembles, such as animals from the air, targeting pinnipeds, such as seals and sea lions, from aerial imagery. Lastly, for those of you interested in learning more about kitware, we have an exhibition booth running for the duration of the conference. So definitely feel free to stop by if you have any additional questions about this work or you're interested in internships or hiring opportunities.